People who have had to kill in self-defense? What's your story? Story 1. When I was 8 years old, we lived in a farmhouse surrounded by an orchard. The nearest town was about 10 minutes away, and my dad worked far enough away that he stayed there during the week. One morning, I heard my mom yelling, and I thought I had missed the bus. I got out of bed and saw a naked man attacking her, trying to grab her. He had been on a bender, stumbled upon our house, and broke in. Our dog was barking and nipping at him, but she wasn't trained to attack or defend. I ran back to my room, grabbed the little .22 bolt action rifle my dad had given me, and got the ammunition I was supposed to keep separate. Loading it felt like it took forever, but I managed to load the 5 rounds. I followed the sound of the dog barking and saw the man dragging my mom by her hair. I tried to stay steady like my dad had taught me and fired over and over again. I didn't know it at the time, but 3 out of the 5 shots hit him. The man was later found by police at a hospital about an hour away, where someone had dropped him off anonymously. One of the bullets had lodged in his lung. At that age, it was hard for me to process what had happened, especially because the state mandated I see a counselor. She kept suggesting I should feel all kinds of emotions that I didn't, which made me think there was something wrong with me. In the end, I just felt grateful that my parents trusted me and took the time to teach me not to panic in tough situations. Story 2. Back in 2003, when I was 14, I visited my aunt and uncle in Texas during my 2-week Christmas break. We were all supposed to attend my cousin's baby shower, but I came down with chickenpox. Being young and stubborn, I didn't want to go anyway, so I convinced them to leave without me. I spent a few hours playing Halo in the master bedroom when I suddenly heard a window shatter and the alarm blare. I remember that my uncle kept a gun behind the TV, so I grabbed it. It was a revolver, though I couldn't tell you what kind. All I remember is that the hammer was really hard to pull back. About 5 minutes later, I heard someone coming up the stairs. I yelled at him to leave and told him I had a gun, but my voice probably sounded too young and scared to be convincing. When he reached the top of the stairs, I fired. The recoil made me drop the gun, but I must have hit him because he fell backward down the stairs. I called 911, and the police arrived a while later. It turned out that the man had recently been released from prison. He had been a drunk driver who hit a delivery guy on a bike during one of his benders. My uncle had been his defense attorney, but the case was impossible to win since security footage showed the hit and run. The man had blamed my uncle for his 5 years in prison and came to take revenge. I never found out if the fall killed him or if it was the gunshot, but I hope it wasn't the latter. Story 3. Throw away for obvious reasons. Back in 2012, 2 men broke into my house through the back door. It took them a while since it was a metal door with a metal frame, sturdy hinges, and a strong lock. One of the men, who was about 6 feet 6 inches and very large, eventually broke it off the hinges with a crowbar. When I heard them hammering on the door, I told my wife to call the police and lock herself and our baby behind 2 doors. I grabbed a shotgun and positioned myself in the hallway, yelling at them to leave, warning them that the police were on the way and that I was armed. They ignored me and kept going. Eventually, I heard a loud pop and realized they had broken through the door. I told them clearly that if I saw them in my house, I would kill them. Seconds later, they rounded the corner, both holding what looked like weapons. I shot the larger man twice in the chest. The other man froze, looking confused as he processed what had just happened. He then took a step toward me and I shot him too. The police arrived about 2 minutes later. Both intruders died at the scene. One had a knife and duct tape, while the other had the crowbar. I later learned that the larger man was wanted in another state for manslaughter after killing his girlfriend. I have no regrets about that night. They had multiple chances to leave, and I'm certain they would have hurt my family if I hadn't stopped them. Story 4. This happened around 2004 to 2006. I don't remember the exact year anymore. I killed a man who tried to break into my apartment because he was looking for his wife, whom he had just beaten severely. At 2 a.m., I heard them arguing through the bathroom wall. I shut both my bathroom and bedroom doors to try to drown it out. By 2:15 a.m., she was banging on my door. When I opened it, I saw her with a broken nose, a swollen left eye, and limping after falling while escaping. I told her to go to the bathroom, clean herself up, and then hide in my bedroom. A few minutes later, her husband came out of their apartment, yelling her name. He noticed the trail of blood leading to my door and started banging on it, screaming for me to let him in. I warned him 3 times to stop, telling him I would kill him if he didn't. He kicked the lock, forcing the door open. The moment the door swung open, I brought a baseball bat down on his head. He fell to the ground, stunned and lying on his stomach. That's when I saw a handgun tucked into the back of his shirt. I grabbed the gun, threw it into my apartment, and warned him one last time. He got up and charged at me. I hit him in the stomach with the bat, and when he didn't stop, I swung the bat down on his head one final time, caving in his skull. Blood spattered everywhere. I knew he was dead instantly. Thankfully, the neighbors had already called the police when the commotion started. The moment he fell to the ground, the police arrived at the top of the stairs. It hasn't affected me as much as it probably should have. I reacted the best way I could given the situation, and I don't dwell on what happened. I can't change the past. Story 5. About 10 years ago, I was jumped by 4 guys. They knocked me to the ground and started punching and kicking me. In the chaos, I managed to grab a knife from my pocket. I reached up and stabbed one of them in the stomach. There was blood everywhere, some mine but mostly his. The moment that happened, they all ran. As they fled, one of them shouted that he would find me later and kill me. The man I stabbed ended up dying at the hospital because he took too long to get medical help. I've never really felt bad about it, and I don't regret it. Occasionally it pops into my head, and I feel weird about having taken someone's life, but the feeling doesn't last long. I believe I was protecting myself, and whether or not they would have killed me, I feel my actions were not only justified, but exactly what I should have done. Story 6. During my senior year of college, I lived in an off-campus apartment in a really bad part of town. My roommates and I often went to the batting cages for fun, so each of us had our own baseball bat. One Friday night, I heard a loud bang at the back door. At first, I thought it was just one of my roommates who had locked themselves out after a night of drinking. When I went to check, I saw a guy in the kitchen wearing a ski mask. Without thinking, I grabbed one of the baseball bats and swung at him as hard as I could. The bat hit him square in the head and he fell backward, crashing into a sliding closet door. 2 of my roommates came running out of their rooms. I was just standing there, staring at the guy bleeding profusely on our kitchen floor. One of my roommates called 911 while the other pulled off the ski mask, and we tried to stop the bleeding with it. The lights were still off, so I hadn't realized just how much blood there was until later. The police arrived what felt like an eternity later, followed by an ambulance that wheeled the guy out. He didn't survive long after that. While we were giving our statements to the police, our last roommate came home. He walked in, saw the mess, and gave us this look like, "What the hell happened?" All I could think to say was, "I broke your bat, I'm sorry." He didn't care about the bat, but I just didn't know what else to say. None of us slept that night. We stayed up watching South Park on Netflix and all called out of work the next day. I remember feeling a sense of disbelief. It was hard to process what had just happened. I never felt bad about it, though. For a while, I wondered what led that guy to break into our place, but I've come to terms with it. Story 7. Back in 1995, I lived in a quiet neighborhood in the San Francisco East Bay with my wife and our 20-month-old daughter. We had a small 2-story, 3-bedroom house, and one of the upstairs bedrooms was my home office. One quiet Saturday morning, I was in my office playing Command & Conquer on my computer with my headphones on, completely oblivious to the world outside. After about an hour during a quiet moment in the game, I faintly heard my wife cry out downstairs. I took off my headphones to check if she needed help, and I'll never forget what I heard next. A man with a thick Mexican accent was yelling, "Quit yelling, bitch, or I'll cut your head off and F your daughter." My daughter was crying hysterically. At that moment, something in me switched off. I wasn't thinking, just acting. I don't even remember opening the lockbox on my desk to grab my .45 handgun. I only remember walking down the stairs, terrified that I might find my wife dead. When I reached the bottom, I saw my wife half naked, bleeding from her upper body, bent over the couch. The man was raping her while holding a knife in one hand. He was fully engaged in the act and had no idea I was standing there. Without saying a word, I grabbed his knife arm with my left hand and pulled him off of her. As he turned toward me with a confused look on his face, I shot him square in the chest at point-blank range. He fell to one knee, and I fired 2 more shots, one hitting his neck and the other missing entirely. I was later told the first shot was the fatal one. At that moment, my only thought was to protect my daughter from seeing any more of what was happening. I didn't even stop to check on my wife. I scooped up my daughter and walked out of the house. Outside, I saw a neighbor staring at my house, pale-faced after hearing the gunshots. I asked him to hold my daughter while I went back inside to check on my wife. He looked horrified, likely because I was covered in blood, but I handed him both my daughter and the gun before heading back inside. The police arrived shortly after. They questioned the circumstances of the shooting, with one detective calling it more of an execution than self-defense. Ultimately, they didn't press charges. The man turned out to be a repeat offender with a history of violent rapes, including one against a 9-year-old girl. Under California's three strikes law, he would have faced life in prison if I hadn't killed him. Recovering from the event was a long process. I can't wear noise-canceling headphones anymore without having panic attacks, knowing I might miss something happening around me. It also haunts me that I was only 30 feet away when it all started, completely unaware for nearly 10 minutes. My wife had an even harder time. In addition to the stab wounds on her shoulder and arm and the physical trauma of the rape, she suffered a mental breakdown that took years to heal. For months, she couldn't be in a room alone, and for over a year, she couldn't be in a house by herself. Even decades later, hearing men with deep Hispanic accents causes her to shake uncontrollably. She's managed to move on in most ways, but discussing the event is still unbearable for her. For me, the memory lingers, and while I've come to terms with my actions, the what-ifs and the lasting damage to my family will always stay with me. Story 8. My house had been robbed twice while I was at work. One day I called out sick, and while I was sleeping, I heard someone downstairs. I called out, "Who's there?" At my job, supervisors would sometimes check if we were actually home when we called out sick, but they always knocked first. I was worried because I hadn't heard a knock or the doorbell. Then I heard footsteps running up the stairs. I shouted that I was armed, but the footsteps got louder. My supervisor would have stopped, so I knew something was wrong. I got behind the door and two men charged into my room with guns. I moved my arm and they turned around. I shot one of them in the neck as he fired into the wall behind me. The other man ran downstairs and fled. It turned out the man I shot was my coworker's cousin, who had learned my schedule and knew when I wasn't home. My coworker wasn't involved, but the second man was the cousin's friend. I wasn't charged and I don't feel guilty. After being robbed twice in 2 months, I already felt violated. However, I eventually changed jobs because I was uncomfortable working around people who knew about what had happened. Story 9. About a decade ago, I was walking home when two kids tried to rob me. I'm not sure how old they were, but they were short and scrawny, likely teenagers. At the time, I was deep in depression, constantly contemplating suicide. That detachment from life made me strangely calm, which seemed to agitate the one holding the gun even more. Both kids were probably on drugs. The one with the gun kept yelling, and I instinctively reached out to grab it. In the struggle, the gun fired twice, hitting and killing him. The second kid, who turned out to be his brother, started screaming and charged at me with a knife. I shot him and kept firing until the gun ran out of bullets. When I called the police, they barely cared. Two junkie kids on drugs didn't seem to warrant much concern. It might have been different if I lived in the US. At the time, I wasn't freaked out, and that lack of reaction scared me more than anything. I thought I was some kind of monster. A year later, after starting medication for my depression, the weight of what had happened hit me hard. I turned to drinking to cope, and it took a long time to climb out of that hole. Storytime. I work graveyard shifts at a gas station in a part of town where a good neighborhood borders a bad one. A few years ago, 4 to 5, I try not to think about it, I was in the back room stocking shelves when I heard the front door open. I came out and walked straight into two young men with guns drawn. I carry a weapon, but I knew better than to try drawing against someone already aiming at me. I put my hands up and froze. One of them grabbed me by the back of my shirt and dragged me to the register, while the other started grabbing Newports and scratch tickets. At the register, I opened the till as Guy 1 held a gun to my head and brought me to the cigarette display. Meanwhile, his friend emptied the register. While they were switching places, Guy 1 said something like, "Hurry up, blood, let's murk this fool," and gestured with his gun. That's when I saw it. His gun had no magazine. His friend still had a gun, but it was tucked into his waistband under a long shirt, and he wasn't paying attention. Unfortunately for them, my CZ-75 compact wasn't empty. I smacked Guy 1 in the head as hard as I could with my right hand, drew my gun, and fired 2 shots from the hip. The first hit him in the upper chest, and the second went through the base of his neck, killing him instantly and spraying the cigarette display with blood. I spun toward guy 2 and fired 3 more times, hitting him once in the abdomen and twice in the chest. He collapsed where he stood. Afterward, I called 911 and sat on the floor, shaking as the adrenaline wore off. The police arrived about 10 minutes later. They questioned me for about 20 minutes and confiscated my weapon, but that was the extent of it. I had nightmares for about a month until the lead detective told me these two had previously robbed other stores, severely beating or killing the clerks. After learning that, the nightmares stopped. I was just glad I stopped them from hurting anyone else. Story 11. Growing up in a dangerous neighborhood, I was taught gun safety as a teenager and regularly practiced at the shooting range with my dad and brothers. One day after returning home from college, I found someone going through my belongings in my bedroom. As soon as he saw me, he came at me with a knife. I pulled my gun out of my purse and shot him in the chest. It all happened so fast. All I could think about was the knife, his proximity, and how he had a physical advantage over me. I needed to stop him before he got close enough to use his strength to hurt or rape me. I didn't aim or intend to kill him. I just wanted to keep him from getting near me. I don't regret pulling the trigger, but I still have nightmares about what could have happened if I hadn't been armed that day. Edit, I live in South Africa, where there is a false belief among some that having sex with a virgin cures AIDS. At the time, there had been several reported rapes in my neighborhood, and that fear was constantly on my mind. Story 12. A few years ago, as I was preparing to leave the army, I sent my wife and kids home early so I could focus on the move and finish selling the house. I left both of my cars with my wife, so my house looked empty. I stayed back with just the essentials, some knickknacks and my 45S and WM and P, sleeping on the floor of the master bedroom, which was at the top of the stairs. One night, 3 men broke in by shattering the back door's glass panel, waking me up. I overheard them talking downstairs about taking my laptop and TV, then deciding to check upstairs. As soon as I heard a creak on the first step, I yelled that I had a gun. They didn't stop. Instead, they rushed up the stairs and into my room. I shot the first guy in the neck, killing him instantly. The second guy fired at me and missed. I shot him in the shoulder. The third man ran back downstairs and fled. I kicked their guns down the stairs and called 911. The cops arrived about 10 minutes later, took my statement, and confiscated my weapon for evidence. The man shot in the shoulder was in agony, while the man shot in the neck was already dead. They never caught the third guy. 3 years later, I still think about it sometimes. What bothers me most is that the house was nearly empty. The guy who died lost his life for almost nothing. I also fear that the man I wounded might come looking for me one day. I've struggled mentally since then, especially with everything I saw during deployments. This just adds to it. I've sought professional help, but it's not for me. Instead, I've found my own way of coping, like smoking a little weed at night to relax and sleep. If it happened again, I'd do the same thing in a heartbeat, especially if my family were there. For anyone wondering, I eventually got my gun back a couple of months later after it was used as evidence. Lastly, to anyone reading this, please take the time to thank not only armed forces, but also your local firefighters, police, and medical workers. These people save lives every day. Story 13. I am 5 feet 2 inches and weigh just under 100 pounds. I've always been small, and looking back, probably an easy target. I grew up in a privileged household, successful parents, only child, and was used to the greener grass side of life. When I went to college in a not-so-safe area of Southern California, it was a huge culture shock. My school was highly ranked, but it was located in a neighborhood with high crime rates. One night around 1 a.m., I was walking home from the library. Normally I drive, but I had lent my car to my roommate, so I decided to walk instead. I could have taken the shuttle, but I thought walking would be good exercise. I was young and reckless. About 10 minutes from my apartment, I noticed someone following me. I didn't think much of it, as the area had a lot of homeless people who were usually harmless. What I didn't realize was that another person was in front of me, effectively herding me into a trap. The police later told me I wasn't a random target. They had planned this. When I turned a corner, everything went black. I woke up sitting on the ground in an alleyway with 3 men towering over me. 2 of them held knives and told me if I screamed, they'd make sure no one could identify my body. They grabbed me by the hair and dragged me further into the alley. They forced me onto my stomach. One held my hair in hands and another pressed down on my calves and thighs, pinning me. I was choking on my tears, trying not to make a sound as I felt a knife pressed to my neck. They rifled through my bag, taking my iPod, iPhone, and $200 in cash. Then they kicked me in the side, knocking the wind out of me. One of them suggested leaving, but another said, "Let's have some fun with this Asian bitch." I remember a debate about whether or not I was Asian. I'm half, but the details are blurry. When I felt someone pulling down my jeans, I started screaming and flailing. They kicked me harder and cut my shoulder during the struggle. I managed to free an arm, grab the knife by the blade, and wrestle it away from the man holding me. The pain from grabbing the blade made me feel alive, not scared. I lashed out, trying to stab him in any way I could. It wasn't as easy as movies make it seem. The knife barely went in, but I kept trying. When I finally managed to stab him deeply, I hit his eye. He stopped moving and fell. The others screamed and ran. When the pressure on me was gone, I looked up and saw him lying still. I don't know if he died immediately or passed out from the shock, but I screamed and cried until I passed out too. I woke up to sirens and was taken to the hospital. I had multiple stab wounds, 3 broken ribs, and numerous fractures. I underwent intensive surgery and spent weeks recovering. The detectives later told me the man I stabbed didn't survive. They apologized that he wouldn't rot in prison, but I was relieved. My only thought was, good, I hope he rots in hell. Story 14. During a massive natural disaster, our area was far enough away to avoid total destruction, but close enough that most law enforcement and emergency services were diverted to the worst affected areas. This left the region vulnerable, and criminals took full advantage. Break-ins, thefts, assaults, even murder. It was a terrifying time. One day I went into town to get supplies and was driving back with gas and food in the bed of my pickup. I probably should have covered it, but I didn't. At a stop sign, 2 men jumped me, one armed with a machete and the other with what looked like a high-point handgun. They were yelling, threatening me, and demanding I get out of the truck. Fortunately, my Glock was in the door. Time felt like it slowed down. I remember seeing the gunman's eyes widen as I pulled it out. I shot him in the stomach and chest, and then I hit the man with the machete in the chin. Blood sprayed everywhere, more than I'd ever seen while hunting. The teeth were a horrific sight, and something they don't show in movies is how people often lose control of their bowels when they die. The man with the machete died instantly, while the gunman curled up and made noises I couldn't hear clearly because the gunfire had messed with my hearing. EMS and deputies took ages to arrive, and the gunman died shortly after they got there. Legally, it was a clear case of self-defense. I didn't feel much sympathy for them. When you attack someone, you should expect the possibility of such an outcome. Since then, I've been more cautious and had random adrenaline rushes and feelings of danger for a few weeks after the incident. Story 15. About 11 years ago, in late 1999, I was jumped by 2 men in a small park in Whitney, Washington. It was summer, around 8:45 or 9 p.m., and there was still a little natural light left. The park was on a plateau with only 2 ways out, a road and a dirt trail. I had just finished work and decided to run a few laps to burn off energy. After 15 or 20 minutes, I realized I was being watched. The 2 men were trying to herd me into a corner, away from both exits. At first, I thought I was being paranoid, but when I headed toward the dirt trail, one of them ran straight at me. I started sprinting, but he tackled me to the ground, slamming into my hip and lower body. My memory gets hazy here, but I remember struggling on the ground. He wasn't armed, and I went wild, scratching his face, gouging his eyes, pulling his hair, doing anything to get away. The second man arrived with a knife and stabbed me 3 times in the thigh. Luckily, he either wasn't trying to kill me or had poor aim, avoiding my throat or stomach. On the 3rd stab, I thrashed so hard that he lost his grip on the knife. On impulse, I grabbed the knife and hit him in the temple with the butt repeatedly until he stopped moving. It happened so fast that I barely remember ending his life. His companion ran off, leaving me alone in the park with 3 stab wounds and a body. This was before I had a cell phone, and it took 2 hours to get help. Those 2 hours were the worst part. Terrified I'd go to jail, scared the other man would come back, and overwhelmed by the sheer fear of the situation. In the end, I don't regret what I did. I was attacked and wounded and defended myself the best I could. The long-term impact has mostly been paranoia about being followed or watched. Story 16. When I was 16, my family went on a trip to spend time with my uncle, who was dying of cancer. He was my father's closest sibling, and they wanted to have one last trip together. While they were gone, my other uncle, a known crackhead, thief, and liar, broke into our house in broad daylight. He must have thought the house was empty. He smashed the dining room window to get in, wearing a mask to avoid being recognized by the cameras we used during trips. I didn't know it was him when I shot him. He was heading upstairs toward the bedrooms when I fired at him on the stairs. He fell down and later died in the hospital about 2 hours after being shot. When the police arrived, I found out it was my uncle. For a moment, I felt bad, but that feeling didn't last long. He was a terrible person. He spent my cousin's childhood in jail and, when released, went back to drugs. He even stole my cousin's Xbox, computer, and the tires off his car to sell for drug money. His own son wasn't spared. He had also robbed our home when I was much younger. I assumed he wouldn't be stupid enough to try it again, but I was wrong. Over the years, he had stolen thousands of dollars from his own mother, forcing her to sell my grandfather's possessions to keep him out of jail and fund his drug habit. She supported him well into his late 30s. No, I don't feel bad for what I did. In the moment, I reacted as I would have with anyone breaking into my house. Looking back, I wouldn't change a thing. Story 17. This is my dad's story. He's a cop in a rough town near where we live. About 15 years ago, he and 3 of his partners responded to a call about a man who had broken into his mother's house, turned on the gas, and threatened to blow the place up. When they arrived, they found the man sitting in a chair with his arms crossed. They tried reasoning with him, but he refused to cooperate. 2 officers moved to grab him, but he jumped up, flinging them into the walls like rag dolls. That's when they saw he was holding a large kitchen knife. He started stabbing one of the officers in the head. My dad drew his gun as the man turned toward him and another partner, ready to attack. My dad shot him straight in the eye socket, and the man dropped immediately. The officer who was stabbed survived. The knife had only grazed his head, and the other stabs missed. 2 of the other officers were fine, but one had to leave the force due to permanent hearing damage. Later, the autopsy revealed the man's skull was unusually thick, and if my dad had shot him anywhere else in the head, the bullet might not have penetrated. My dad has said many times that he's never wanted to kill someone more in his life. Despite the intensity of the situation, my dad never showed signs of PTSD afterward. Story 18. About 15 years ago, I was living alone in an apartment I had just moved into a week earlier in the western U.S. The neighborhood wasn't terrible, but not great either. One night around 1 a.m., I was trying to fall asleep when I heard movement in the living room. I froze, listening carefully, and then heard someone trip over a box I hadn't unpacked yet. Panic set in. I realized someone had broken in. I didn't have my knife, it was still in the living room, and I had no gun. I decided to stay quiet, hoping the intruder would leave. But then I saw the light from the hallway expand, and a shadow entered my room. I moved to the end of the bed to get the jump on him. As he approached with something in his hand, I tackled him into the nightstand. We fell to the floor, and in the chaos, I ended up on top of him. Fueled by adrenaline, I punched and elbowed him until he stopped moving. When I turned on the light, I saw blood everywhere and a knife on the floor. I kicked the knife away and called the police. But as the adrenaline wore off, I realized how badly I had injured him. When I told the dispatcher, "I think he's dead," I was right. It turned out I'd crushed his skull, and he died before I stopped hitting him. Later, I learned he was a 17-year-old who had been stalking the apartment's previous tenant, a young woman who had broken her lease to escape him. He thought she still lived there. What followed was a nightmare. The media painted me as a villain, a white amateur heavyweight fighter who killed a black teen. The fact that he broke into my apartment with a knife was largely ignored. Activists labeled it a racially motivated murder, and I lost my job after my workplace received threats. The university I trained at dropped me, and I ended up homeless, couch surfing with gym buddies. Thankfully, a lawyer took my case pro bono. He uncovered the stalker history and got the charges dropped, but the damage was done. The media never fully corrected the narrative, and I had to move out of state, change my name, and start over. The whole ordeal left me disillusioned. I quit fighting. No state would sanction me after the incident. I didn't develop PTSD, but I struggle with anger and a lack of trust in people. The experience made me lose faith in humanity, and I've been working to rebuild that ever since. Story 19. In 1994, after completing my basic police training in South Africa, I did a SWAT course as part of the program. While waiting to join a specialized unit as a forensic artist, I was doing my mandatory time in uniform. During my orientation week, I wasn't supposed to go out on patrols for another 2 weeks, but a senior officer asked me to accompany him to drop off awaiting trial prisoners at court because he couldn't or wasn't allowed to do it alone. On the way back to the station, just a block away, a pickup truck with 4 armed men in the back and 3 in the cab drove past. They were being followed by a tow truck driver who shouted that the men had just robbed a nearby casino. We gave chase, though it was at an unnervingly slow pace, much closer than I was comfortable with. The officer driving the vehicle was shot in the arm during the pursuit. I remember him shouting, "Ouch!" Not in a dramatic Hollywood way, but in a matter-of-fact tone that seemed absurd in the moment. I also vividly recall the sting of glass fragments hitting my face when the window shattered. I fired at their vehicle and hit the driver in the shoulder, or so I thought. Their truck eventually came to a stop after crashing into a heap of building sand on the sidewalk. The driver later died, but I wasn't informed until much later when they took my statement. It turned out I'd hit him twice, and one of the bullets had narrowly missed his spine. As we secured the scene, one of the men jumped off the truck and started running, pointing his gun backward at us. I fired and hit him. He died at the scene. I watched the life leave his eyes. When I checked his gun, I saw it was severely jammed. It became clear why he hadn't fired back while running. It wasn't because he didn't want to, but because he couldn't. I've never felt guilty about what happened, though I've often felt guilty for not feeling guilt. I'm not a psychologist, but it's something that has puzzled me for years. I empathize deeply with people, to the point where I can't even watch prank shows because I feel bad for the victims. Yet in this case, there's just nothing. The officer who was driving that day survived the gunshot wound, but was killed a few years later in a gang-style hit as he pulled into his driveway. He was often involved in secretive meetings and activities while I waited in the patrol vehicle, so it wasn't entirely surprising. Looking back, I accept what happened that day as part of the job, but it's one of those moments that stays with you, no matter how much time passes. Story 20. Nearly 25 years ago, I was carjacked in Newport News, Virginia, during a time when such crimes were rampant in certain cities in the eastern United States. Instead of just shooting me outright, the guy who carjacked me made me drive him to several crack houses, dragging me inside each time. He forced me to withdraw cash from an ATM to buy drugs for him, and this went on for what felt like hours but was probably only 1 or 2. At some point, he began to lose focus and wasn't paying attention to me as we got back in the car. My tire iron was under the front seat. I grabbed it and smashed his face in with all the strength I had. I heard his bones crack and blood sprayed everywhere. I pushed him out of the car and drove home. When I got home, I was a mess. I puked, got drunk, puked again, raged, and finally passed out. I never called the cops and was never questioned. I only talked about it with a couple of friends. To this day, I don't know if he survived, though I doubt it. I've always assumed he died. I don't lose sleep over it. I'm convinced he would have killed me if I hadn't acted. The adrenaline come-down was brutal, but after that, I realized I was capable of killing someone if necessary. That knowledge still lingers in the back of my mind. Story 21. Back in 2006, while I was in college in Texas, I killed 2 men during a home invasion. Guns are a way of life here, and I had about 8 to 10 firearms and thousands of rounds of ammo in my apartment. My dad raised me to be prepared for any situation, and I had extensive training with firearms. These men couldn't have chosen a worse person to rob. I lived in a rundown second-story apartment on the edge of a bad neighborhood. I think they targeted me because my neighbor sold drugs, and we hung out often, so they likely assumed I was dealing too. Around 12:30 a.m., I was playing Oblivion when I heard 2 sets of footsteps coming up the stairs, trying way too hard to be quiet. Peeking out the window, I saw one had a hammer and the other a large hunting knife. My stomach dropped. I grabbed my Glock 17 and moved toward the front door, thinking they might be after my neighbor. I yelled, "The police are on their way and I'm armed to the teeth. If you come in here, you're going to get popped." They didn't stop. When they broke down the door, instinct took over. I made eye contact with the first man and fired 3 shots into each of their chests within seconds. They both dropped. The downstairs neighbor called the police, who arrived about 5 minutes later and declared the men dead at the scene. I didn't feel regret, but the situation left me shaken. I felt bad that they made poor choices and lost their lives, but I was also glad they chose my apartment. I doubt my neighbors were as prepared as I was, and an innocent person could have died. The aftermath was messy. My landlords were furious and complained about the cleanup and how it would affect their records. My neighbors looked at me like I was a psychopath, which I suspect was partly because I'm white, and most of the residents and landlords were black. I moved out soon after. It was the worst night of my life, and my heartbeat didn't slow down for 24 hours. My neighbor came home later that night, smoked me out, and we had a heavy conversation that helped me process it. My boss gave me a week off, and my professors were lenient with assignments. I still think about it, but I've never regretted it. If someone tries to take another person's life, they should expect to lose their own. Story 22. When I was 19, about 3 years ago, I went to a dealer's house to buy some weed. His house was in a sketchy area near mine, so I usually walk there. On my way home, 3 guys, none of them older than 18, came out from behind a building. One aimed a gun at me and told me to hand over everything I had. Terrified, I gave them my phone, wallet, and the weed I just bought. 2 of them took off, but the third stayed behind. He wasn't holding the gun but pulled out a knife and said, "Sorry, man, but you saw my face." Then he lunged at me. Without thinking, I pulled the knife from my pocket and stabbed him in the stomach. He managed to cut my arm open, but I'd fully lodged my knife in him. As he fell, I scrambled off the street to hide from view and called 911. The police and an ambulance arrived within 5 minutes, though it felt like an eternity. The kid was taken to the hospital, where he died that night. I cried into the officer's jacket while being questioned, and he told me, "It was either you or him. You made the right choice." Those words helped me process what happened. I still think about it, but I don't regret it anymore. I did what I had to do. Story 23. Growing up, there was an ongoing war between 2 schools in my hometown, the French school and the English school. It started as stupid fights but escalated when someone used a baseball bat, and after that, people began carrying knives, brass knuckles, and broken bottles. One night, I was hanging out with 4 to 5 friends, my stepbrother, and some girls, including my girlfriend, playing soccer. Some drunk English girls started arguing with our group, and after we chased them off, we decided to leave. Before we could, about 30 people showed up armed with bats, knives, broken bottles, and chains. My stepbrother and 2 friends ran to call the police, but the group surrounded us and made it clear they were ready to attack. I pulled a Rambo knife from my boot and told them that the first person to try anything would die by this blade. For what felt like 15 minutes, we stood off. They yelled, their girls egged them on, and I kept repeating my warning. Eventually, one guy with a pocket knife charged me. I stabbed him in the leg, he stabbed me in the stomach, and I stabbed him in the throat. Blood was everywhere. The group fled, leaving me, my friends, and one girl holding the guy, screaming and crying. The police arrived shortly after, but he was already dead. I went through years of therapy. I even met his brother years later and apologized. I don't regret standing my ground. I did what I had to do to protect myself and my friends. It's a shame that he got caught up in something so stupid. The worst part was people praising me for it. I even punched someone who called me a hero, but I've never had nightmares or regret about it. Story 24. About a year and a half ago, my girlfriend and I were in New York City for a long weekend. I grew up there, but it was her first visit, so we planned to explore the city and enjoy the sights. One night, after dinner and drinks, we were walking back to our hotel. The street was mostly empty when a man stepped out of an alley holding a knife. He demanded our wallets, phones, and jewelry. At first, he seemed calm, but quickly became erratic, repeating himself and bouncing on his feet. I tried to de-escalate by tossing the little cash I had on the ground, telling him to take it and go. He snapped, screaming that he was going to F your bitch, and lunged at us. Everything after that was a blur. I'd been training in a defense-based martial art for 4 years, and my instincts kicked in. The struggle ended with him on the ground, my knife lodged above his collarbone. I had a cut on my arm that required stitches and a cut lip, likely from a punch he threw. He died at the scene. Witnesses who heard my girlfriend screaming gave statements to the police, and I answered their questions. A month later, my girlfriend left me saying, "I can't be with someone who would take the life of another." I don't blame her. I hope she finds peace. As for me, I know I did what I had to do to protect us. I regret nothing. Story 25. In July 2010, I was in Sangin, Afghanistan. I was a truck driver, but after my truck got blown up, I was stuck with a grunt platoon for 3 weeks until the next resupply run. During that time, I offered to help out by manning firewatch in the turret of an MRAP. My job was simple: sit in the turret with a 240B for 4 hours a day. The rest of the time, I just hang around. It wasn't a bad deal. One evening, during a shift from around 1700 to 2100, I was in the turret as the sun went down. I heard AK fire in the distance, which had become routine. The enemy would take pot shots, retreat, and sometimes come back hours later to do it again. This time, about 10 minutes after the AK fire started, I heard mortars. A grunt hopped into the truck, turned on the comms, and we learned the action was happening on the north side of our little cop. We were trained to ignore anything outside our sector, so I didn't think much of it, until a few rounds hit the side window of the MR app behind me. I spun the turret 180 degrees and got a call from a grunt sergeant in a nearby fighting hole. He told me to fire at the gate of a house behind us. He said he'd seen someone pop over the gate and shoot. I couldn't see behind the gate. It was a solid piece of aluminum. But just as I aimed, I saw two silhouettes appear, firing at us. I pulled the trigger and fired 3 bursts of 7 to 10 rounds each with the 240B. The sergeant called for me to stop after the bursts. 20 minutes later, when the firefight ended, a few grunts went to check the house. They came back and told me there were 3 dead behind the gate, 2 with AKs and 1 with an RPD. Those were my first confirmed kills. I felt cool about it at first. I think that was just my conscious mind trying to rationalize what happened and protect me. I've fired at other targets before, but in those cases, there were multiple people shooting, so I never knew for sure if I hit anyone. This time, though, I knew those 3 were mine. I remember everything clearly. The date, July 5th, the song on my iPod, When the Man Comes Around by Johnny Cash. It's strange because I feel so much about it, but at the same time, I feel nothing. Since leaving the military, I've been diagnosed with PTSD and struggled with addiction so severely that I had to move to a different state to escape it. I think those moments on the turret changed something deep inside me, something I still can't fully understand. Story 26. I work the night shift and usually get home around 1 or 1:30 a.m. Most nights my mother's asleep, but this time, I noticed the living room lights were on and saw 2 large shadows moving around inside the house. It was extremely unusual. I unclipped my Smith & Wesson SD9VE from my holster and carefully peeked through a window. Inside, 2 men in their mid-40s were ransacking the living room, throwing things around and rummaging through drawers. One of them had a handgun. My first instinct was to stay outside, call the police, and keep an eye on them to make sure they didn't go upstairs where the bedrooms are. Then I glanced at the couch and saw my mother huddled there with my 12-year-old niece, who must have been staying the night. My heart dropped. I knew waiting for the police wasn't an option. Things could go south before they arrived. I managed to catch my mother's attention and signaled her to cover my niece's eyes and ears. Then I waited until the 2 men moved to the far side of the room. Slowly, I turned the doorknob and burst into the house with my weapon aimed at the man holding the gun. In a commanding voice I didn't know I had, I told him to drop his weapon. What happened next felt like slow motion. I saw his arm start to rise and I fired 3 shots into his center mass. The second man reached behind his back, and I had no choice but to fire 4 rounds into him. What I can tell you is that it's nothing like the movies. People don't just drop instantly. They gurgle, cry, and ask for family members. One of them even asked me why I did it. It's messy, it's raw, and it stays with you. I try to justify it by telling myself that I likely saved others who might have encountered them if they'd walked free. The sheepdog analogy feels fitting. I acted to protect my family. I know that if I hadn't pulled the trigger, I would have been killed along with my mother and niece. I made the choice, and while it was the right one, it's not an easy thing to live with. Story 27. When I was 21, I was in college and very much a party girl. I met an older businessman at a club, and we started dating. He would take me out, buy me things, and let me stay at his house while he was away on business trips. One night, while he was out of the country, I woke up to the sound of glass shattering. My heart started pounding as I heard a man's voice downstairs saying something to his accomplice about what to take. Then he mentioned he was going to check upstairs. Panicked, I looked around the bedroom for something, anything, I could use to defend myself. My eyes landed on a vase. I grabbed it and waited, heart racing, until the door opened. As soon as I saw the figure step in, I threw the vase as hard as I could. It shattered, but the man kept advancing. He started punching and kicking me. When I stopped resisting, he lifted me over his shoulder, carried me downstairs, and laid me on the kitchen countertop. What he said next still haunts me. "Look what I found. Hurry up and you can have seconds." He began feeling me up, and I felt utterly helpless, until I glanced over and saw the wooden block of steak knives on the counter. With all the strength I had left, I grabbed one and started slashing and stabbing. I felt his blood splattering everywhere. He eventually staggered back, and he and his accomplice ran. Shaking and terrified, I dialed 911. I don't even remember what I said, but the operator kept telling me everything was going to be okay and that police and an ambulance were on the way. Later, I found out that the man I stabbed lost so much blood, he collapsed and died outside the house. The memory of that night still gives me nightmares. The fear, his words, and the violence. Those moments are burned into my mind forever. Story 28. A relative once told me a story from his younger days when he or his roommates were involved with low-level drug dealers. One night, two men invaded their apartment, aiming to steal drugs, money, or both. At least one of the intruders was armed. They forced my relative and his roommate to lie on the floor on their stomachs. One of the intruders started duct taping their hands behind their backs while the other stood guard. At some point, while taping my relative's roommate, the intruder set his gun down within reach of my relative, who hadn't yet been bound. Without hesitation, my relative grabbed the gun and fired, killing one of the intruders instantly. The second man fled, and the invasion was over. This happened in the 1980s, and my relative survived to recount the story to me decades later. He didn't speak about it with pride. In fact, he seemed ashamed, not only of the lifestyle he had been caught up in, but also because the incident haunted him. He hadn't planned to tell me until a conversation about self-defense brought it up, and I could tell it weighed on him even years later. Story 29. Growing up, I was the stepchild in my family, and my 350-pound bodybuilding stepfather treated me like an outsider. He abused me every day for as long as I can remember, slapping, hitting, throwing me through windows, and smashing my skull into concrete. My mom couldn't leave him because he was the main breadwinner, and when my younger brother was born, the situation became permanent. I escaped the abuse when I left for college, cutting all contact. My stepfather developed leukemia and became addicted to painkillers, which led to crack use. Still, I stayed away until my mom developed end-stage kidney disease. She needed someone to take her to appointments and dialysis, so I moved back in to care for her. One day, I heard her yelp. I stepped out of my room and found my stepfather trying to kill her puppy with a steak knife. My mom was trying to stop him, so I stepped in and told him to go to bed and sleep it off. He turned his rage on me. He lunged at me with the knife, but he was wearing socks on the hardwood floor and slipped, hitting his head on the corner of the dining room table. That only enraged him more. He started punching and kicking me, breaking my jaw and ribs, but I managed to protect myself as best I could. When he went to grab his keys, I thought he was leaving, but he returned with a large buck knife. He slashed at me, cutting my abdomen, but my mom stepped in again. He dropped the knife, grabbed a shotgun, and pointed it at me. If my mom hadn't stood between us, he would have killed me. He left the house with the shotgun, and I told my mom it was over. We packed bags, grabbed the dogs, and went to an aunt's house he didn't know about. I called the police, and they took statements and photos of my injuries. Broken ribs, a fractured orbital bone, a broken jaw, and more. My stepfather was arrested a few days later and spent 74 days in jail. In that time, I emptied the house, shut off all utilities, and moved my mom and myself out permanently. Sadly, my mom passed away in February. Despite claims that my stepfather is now better and attends church, he continues to violate probation and threaten me. I've received death threats, so I've armed myself and taken every precaution. My home is now heavily secured. I have a concealed carry permit, a loaded shotgun near the door, and multiple firearms throughout the apartment. I also attend counseling for PTSD and depression. While I wish I didn't live this way, I'm prepared to protect myself if he ever tries to find me again. Story 30. 3 years ago, I was fresh out of college and had just moved into a cheap rental in a bad area. My family had cut me off, and I didn't have many other options. Given the neighborhood, I decided to buy a small gun for protection, a Taurus 709 Slim. Not long after I moved in, my older sister moved in with me because of issues with her boyfriend. She helped cover essentials and was a huge support during that time. There were frequent rumors of crime in the area, including a string of break-ins. Someone had been robbing houses in a strangely methodical way, entering, stealing, and even closing the door behind them. About 5 months in, my sister moved back in with her boyfriend. The very next night, I came home from work, browsed Reddit for a bit, and went to bed early around 9 p.m. It was pitch black outside, and though I wasn't asleep yet, I needed to pee but didn't want to get up. I heard the distinct creak of the back door opening. Heart racing, I grabbed my gun from my backpack on the floor beside my bed and went downstairs, intentionally making noise as I moved. I didn't yell that I had a gun, but I stopped on the stairs and clicked the safety off loudly, hoping they'd hear. Instead, a man's voice called out, "Stay back, or I'll cut you." He clearly didn't hear the click. When I turned into the kitchen, I saw him and, without hesitation, took a second to aim and fired. I hit him in the stomach. He tried to run but tripped on the doorstep and collapsed outside. He didn't get back up. I called 911 and kept my gun trained on him for a few minutes, but eventually I dropped it and sat down. The weight of what I'd just done hit me, but not in the way I expected. I wasn't panicked or overwhelmed. I felt numb. It was unsettling how easy it had been. While waiting for the police, I grabbed a Mountain Dew from the fridge and sat there. When the cops arrived, they identified the body. I never looked. It turned out to be my sister's boyfriend. He'd come back to steal her belongings and some of my things as well. My sister was devastated but didn't blame me. We still talk often, though the memory of that night lingers. I've never told anyone else about it. It's something I carry silently, knowing it was necessary but never fully understanding how it changed me. Story 31. It was 15 minutes until closing. A guy came in, grabbed a 32-ounce High Life, came to the counter and paid for it. Totally normal. I bagged it up, said thanks, and thought that was it. Then he reached into the opening under the bulletproof glass and grabbed one of the $5 pocket knives we sold. Without a word, he just started walking toward the exit like he hadn't just stolen something right in front of me. I was 21 at the time, and looking like an easy target wasn't something I was willing to let slide. I grabbed my Beretta 92F, bolted out from behind the counter, and chased him down. I tried to pistol whip him in the head, but he ducked, turned around, and suddenly the knife was open in his hand. The situation got real serious, real fast. I backed up a little, pointing my gun at him, yelling at him to put it down. I was shouting "Abajo" and hitting the panic button on the remote clipped to my belt. He didn't seem fazed. Instead, he made a motion across his throat like he was threatening to cut mine. Then he did it again, but this time blood started soaking his shirt. It took me a second to realize what had happened. He had cut his own throat. I kept yelling and hitting the panic button, telling my coworker to call 911. As the guy slumped over, a police car pulled into the driveway. I immediately put the gun down and raised my hands. The cops questioned me for about 15 minutes. My statement matched what they saw when they arrived, and they let me go. The guy didn't survive. The whole thing left me confused for a while. It was just insane. Story 32. 15 years ago, I was sleeping with my next-door neighbor. Her boyfriend was abusive and had repeatedly threatened to kill her if she left him. She had every reason to believe he'd follow through. One day, while we were both in our front gardens, he confronted me, saying he knew about the affair and threatening to kill us both if it happened again. I laughed, told him to F off, and went back inside. That night, I heard him being more violent than usual through our thin walls. Suddenly, she ran out of the house, bleeding from multiple cuts, and banged on my door, screaming that he was going to kill her. I locked the doors and grabbed a knife, waiting near the front door. After about half an hour of him trying to break in, he stopped. I thought he left, but then he smashed through my kitchen window and climbed inside. I tried to talk him down, but he punched me in the mouth, making me drop the knife. We started fighting, and after a while, he pinned me to the ground, choking me. I was ready to accept that I was going to die when, out of the corner of my vision, I saw his girlfriend pick up the knife. She stabbed him in the shoulder and he screamed, got off me, and punched her to the ground. He then grabbed the knife, preparing to stab her. I don't know how I found the strength, but I stood up, gasping for breath, and managed to twist his hand back, breaking it. I grabbed the knife from him and slit his throat. Then I collapsed. I woke up a month later from a coma with a ton of legal issues to deal with. I managed to avoid prison, and my relationship with the woman I nearly died for turned into something real. We got married 5 years later, and now we have a 6-year-old daughter and a son due this September. The only lasting effect is that I sometimes dream of cutting that bastard's throat. I'd do it again if I had to. I'm not a psychopath, but I'll admit, I enjoyed doing it. The guy had it coming. Story 33. I grew up in a rough rural area. My brother was a drug dealer and he owed someone about $1,000. It got so bad that people started showing up at our house regularly, doing weird things to intimidate us. One night, when my brother was out of town, they came to collect. I was in the living room watching TV late at night when the back door was kicked in. Two men rushed in, one armed with a crowbar, the other with a roofing hammer. They came straight for me. I jumped over the couch and ran to my room, with them close behind. I grabbed my hunting rifle off the rack and loaded it as quickly as I could. Luckily, I managed to slam and lock my bedroom door, buying just enough time. I crouched in the corner, heart racing. The door flew open, and I fired without thinking. The bullet hit the first man in the heart, and part of it went through him, hitting the second man. It was a .308 hollow point, and I later learned that the first man died instantly. It was like a bomb went off inside him. The second man survived but lost an eye. He was later charged with breaking and entering, attempted kidnapping, and drug possession. Meth and weed were found in his truck. He's now serving 17 years in prison. The man my brother owed money to never came around again. My brother turned his life around after that. I skipped school for a week, and when I returned, kids kept their distance. I didn't care. Honestly, I felt worse when I shot my first deer. This situation solved a problem. I'm safe, and that's what matters. Story 34. I'm an Afghanistan combat veteran. I've seen a lot of combat, been in countless firefights, and lost too many friends. Because of those losses, I don't feel guilt over what I did to the Taliban. If anything, I wish I had killed more of them. And sometimes I even wish I could have tortured them before killing them. It wasn't always this way. The first time I was shot at, I was terrified. I had one of them in my scope, but I couldn't pull the trigger. I shot over his head instead, hoping it would scare him off. Over time, though, my mindset changed. I went from hesitating to kill, to accepting it, to looking forward to it, to craving it. The more they hurt us, the more I wanted to hurt them. Every time we lost a brother, it pushed me further down this dark path. Now I live with a deep sadness from the violence I witnessed and participated in. My guilt doesn't come from what I did to them. It comes from what I couldn't do for my friends, from being unable to save them. I'm filled with hatred, too much to feel guilt for the lives I took. It's like those World War II veterans who still harbor hatred for the Japanese. For me, it's Muslim men. If it weren't for my wife, who's been with me through my Marine career, I'd probably be in Iraq as a civilian, fighting ISIS. Some days all I want is to kill insurgents until one of them kills me, or until old age takes me. It's not logical, it's pure emotion, fueled by hatred and revenge. War is hell. Story 35. A couple of years ago, my cousin started dating a girl whose ex turned out to be a complete lunatic. One day, while my cousin and his girlfriend were at her house, her ex, high on drugs, showed up with a baseball bat, intent on hurting her. The ex tried the front door but couldn't get in, so he smashed through a massive front window, showering glass everywhere. At the time, my cousin and his girlfriend were in the kitchen, scrambling to get dressed. By the time my cousin was dressed, the ex was already in the house, swinging the glass-covered bat at him. In self-defense, my cousin grabbed a kitchen knife and stabbed him. His intention was to stop the attacker, but the drugs made the man nearly impervious to pain, so it took around 20 stab wounds to bring him down. Once the attacker was down, my cousin put him in the recovery position and called an ambulance. Despite his efforts, the man bled out on the floor. Even though it was self-defense, my cousin was convicted of murder because in the UK, the law often expects people to use reasonable force, which typically means unarmed defense, even against armed attackers. Evidence was later revealed to have been falsified by the police, which led to a reduced sentence. But my cousin is still in prison.